All right, welcome to Reflections on Gaming, a podcast where we talk about games and pop culture at large. We want to start and continue a conversation about things that matter to us. So please feel free to enter into and add to the conversation by adding questions and comments to reflectionsongaming@gmail.com. We look forward to seeing what you want to talk about.
Last week, we talked about IGN's Summer of Gaming and the conferences that have taken place so far during the IGN Summer of Gaming, and we also talked a little bit more about game marketing in general. This week we want to bounce off of what we talked about last week and what we've talked about in the past of what makes games fun, and we're going to discuss one of our favorite franchises that just was talked about at the conferences, Ratchet and Clank.
Right. So last time we talked a little bit about Sony's press conference, how well they did, what made it exciting, what they could have done to make it a little bit better. But we didn't get too much into the specific games they talked about, and that's because we wanted to focus on marketing. But this week, we want to focus on what makes gaming fun. And we're going to use the Ratchet and Clank series to kind of dissect that just a little bit and explain why we enjoy the franchise, probably why other people enjoy the franchise, things that we might disagree with, the general consensus. But mostly we're bringing this up because at the Sony press conference, they announced a new Ratchet and Clank game called Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart.
For a little bit of background on the Ratchet and Clank series, it started on the PS2. I don't know what year, but a long time ago.
2002. It started in 2002.
Look at that. 2002. And the very first title was just Ratchet and Clank, and it follows the story of an alien cat creature, essentially, kind of like a lion creature named a lombax, who's sentient and wears clothes, and he's an engineer, and he works on spaceships. And one day he finds this little robot that kind of escaped from this robot factory that crash landed on his planet. And essentially throughout the whole series, these two, Ratchet and Clank, the little robot, team up and save the universe or galaxy or whatever over and over and over. And that's essentially the base plot line of all the games.
Right, we probably won't go too in depth on the actual stories, mostly because the stories aren't really the main selling point, which is not to say that they're bad. It's just people don't remember them so much for the stories as much as they remember them for the solid gameplay and the tongue-in-cheek humor that the series has. Just to give you kind of an idea, if you have never seen the series before, of what they're all about, here are some titles of the Ratchet and Clank series. The first one is Ratchet and Clank. The second is Ratchet and Clank Going Commando. The third, Ratchet and Clank Up Your Arsenal. Some other ones are Tools of Destruction, Quest for Booty, A Crack in Time, Size Matters, Full Frontal Assault. I think you get the idea that this is a comedy series that doesn't tend to take itself too seriously. Although one of the factors that has made some of the games better over the years is that, as well as that solid tongue-in-cheek humor and double entendres, they have actually managed to increase the quality of the story and made some pretty engaging stories that people became very invested in. But the main the core gameplay in each of the games is a mix between third-person shooting and platforming, with every now and again some puzzles to break up the action and kind of give you a little reprieve from the high-intensity, adrenaline-pumping action.
Yeah, pretty much every game follows the same basic gameplay, with a couple of, obviously every game distinguishes itself with special mechanics, but the main focus of the game, well, I'd say one of the main focuses of the gameplay is guns. It's overall it's a third-person shooter, and as Ratchet, you get to wield a ridiculous arsenal of not just guns, but like bomb gloves. You can have a little, often called Mr. Destructo, a little robot that follows you around and shoots at people. You can get, in most of the games, there's a really special gun that you can get called the Rhino that often plays a special tune as you shoot it, because it's just a ridiculous bullet hell full of missiles and bullets and sometimes lasers and everything else that you can think of.
I think one time it played the national anthem, the U.S. national anthem, and like the bullets came out looking like the flag. Had some pretty ridiculous stuff going on there. I'd say it may be a bit of a misnomer to call them guns, just because this is not at all a realistic game. Everything is massive. The bullets are very large. They move very slowly. And the weapons are in of themselves sometimes used for comedic effect. In every game, there is usually a weapon that will transform your enemies. In the first game, it turned them into chickens. And as you upgraded your weapon, those chickens would then explode when they came close to other enemies. There was one game where you could turn them into monkeys. One of the newer games allows you to pixelate your enemies, which was a really fun idea. Like we mentioned before, this is a series that likes to situate itself very nicely and neatly in the comedy kind of genre, not the Call of Duty or Black, or Black being the game. For anyone that might be confused about me saying that. Battlefield and games like that, where it's a more realistic, the guns are things that you might see in reality.
Yeah, there's nothing gritty about these games. Though I will say that in the leap from PS2 to PS3, in my opinion, there was a little bit more emphasis on the story and a little bit less, like, when it first made its jump to PS3, I felt like the ingenuity and the imaginative guns started, weapons really, it's just a menagerie of weapons, started to go down a little bit, and there was a lot more focus on the story and the platforming, which wasn't my favorite thing. I don't really know what the consensus is. I think a lot of people really liked the jump to HD. With tools of destruction, but
we definitely want to get more in depth about that in a little while. But first, let's talk about why we want to talk about Ratchet and Clank, why we're so jazzed up about this game announcement. And first of all, like we said, this is a series that we hold near and dear to our hearts. I myself have played almost every game in the franchise, and there are 9 games in the main franchise, with 4 spin-off games, as well as a few mobile games, collection re-releases, and all that kind of stuff. So I thoroughly enjoy this, but the reason I'm so excited for the new one isn't just because I enjoy the series, but because it's been years since a new Ratchet and Clank has been released, and even longer since we've seen something that continues kind of the main storyline of the series. Each game is not standalone per se. You could start just about anywhere and have a great time with it. But from the very beginning of the series all the way to this newest game, there has been a consistent storyline that they have been building upon. In fact, in the second game, you actually start in this very nice kind of bachelor pad with this massive TV and all these nice looking trophies from the first game, because Ratchet and Clank have got all this money and are lauded as heroes for saving the galaxy from the events of the first game. So it's been the last time we had an entry that added to this main story was in 2013 with a game called Into the Nexus. And we'll get a little bit more into that game later, talking about the high and low points of the series. But after Into the Nexus was released on the PlayStation 3, there was one game released on the PlayStation 4, and it was a reboot / reimagining of the first game called Ratchet and Clank. And it kind of retconned everything that happened before. took the series back to its roots, and it came out at the same time that a movie did that covered the same events. And while I personally enjoyed the game, and the movie was also really fantastic considering it was based on a video game, it was not what people were looking for, and it was not as good as many of the games that came before it.
Yeah, it was definitely not terribly well received. I think a lot of people are very excited about the new game because the trailer for the new game made it look like they were going back to how it was. Especially, it almost seemed like they were returning a little bit to the PS2 roots with the with kind of the antagonists that they've introduced, that the trailer hinted would be the main antagonist for the game. So that's definitely one reason I'm super excited for it. Is I'm really excited to see them listen to that feedback, hopefully, and make a couple of changes to the formula that Ratchet and Clank in 2016 followed, and kind of return to its roots a little bit from the PS2 era.
Yeah, and obviously, right now we have had a very nice in-engine rendered cutscene and about 2 minutes of very sporadic gameplay, with most of it showing off the capabilities of the PlayStation 5 and its very rapid loading, rather than showing off the gameplay itself. So, there's a lot of conjecture that we're basing this conversation on, and we got to own up to that. But based on what the series creators, Insomniac Games, have pumped out in the past and more recently with the Marvel's Spider-Man game, we have high hopes and are currently putting our hats in, trusting that they will do the series justice, and that this newest game is going to be fantastic. And as such, we're very excited for it. And a lot of people seem to be in the same boat, because there are very few people that have reacted to this negatively. And that's because the series has been just so great for so long.
Which is not to say there haven't been highs and lows. I wasn't sure if that was you wanted to talk about next.
Yeah, I think it'd be a good time to kind of talk about the more specifics of what makes this game fun, and why there are certain games that are regarded as better and certain games that are regarded as worse. Sorry. And I also want to talk about our opinions with that specifically. For example, before you said that you aren't a huge fan of some of the future saga entries, that's the nomenclature for the entries that were released on the PlayStation 3. Whereas general consensus is one of those games is the best in the series so far, which I would agree with. But before we get into the nitty-gritty of that, let's go back to talking about the gameplay and why that gameplay is engaging, because there are hundreds of thousands of games that have third-person shooting in them, and probably even more games that have platforming in them. But not all of those games are fun, so we need to discuss why it is that joining those two things together in Ratchet and Clank makes it an enjoyable experience.
Yeah, I think, thinking back, I can think about two main things that I would say have engaged me the most. The first is that the weapons are upgradable, not through purchasing upgrades, each game has a little bit of a different system, but one thing that has always been true is that the more you use a weapon, the more it will level up. The more enemies that you kill with any particular weapon, the more it will level up. In general, it becomes a max of level 5, and with every level, it becomes more powerful, until finally at level 5, you get basically an entirely new weapon that has a similar function to the old one, but will do very, very different things. Or will just have a super big upgrade as soon as you cross the threshold from level 4 to level 5. For example, Mr. Zircon, and will generally get renamed. Like Mr. Zircon, your little bodyguard robot, when you use Mr. Zircon, every time he attacks an enemy for however much damage he does, he gains a little bit of experience. And of course, it takes longer and longer, but every level you get, he gets a little bit stronger, and he'll stay alive a little bit longer. Until finally, you get to level 5, at which point he becomes no longer Mr. Zircon, but he is Zircon the Destroyer, and has a totally new look, stays out for significantly longer than he did at level 4, and has much more powerful weapons attached to him. And so you're really incentivized to use your whole arsenal and not just stick to your most powerful weapon, because the more you upgrade them, the more options you'll have when you come to a boss, and you're strapped for ammo for your most powerful weapon, like your rocket launcher or your sniper rifle. So that's something I think is really engaging, and I don't know of any other game that has a system like that that works as well.
Well, there's lots and lots of games that allow you to level up your weapons, but I agree that the specific method and the specific genre that Ratchet and Clank falls into, I haven't seen any others that really have that kind of leveling system. But the reason that the weapons are fun is because Ratchet and Clank is not a precision shooter. You're not aiming down your sights constantly to, do a headshot on an enemy or make sure that, you're shooting their weapons out of their hands or anything like that. No. Almost all the time, you're not going to have any crosshairs. You're just going to be running around, rotating in circles, and firing your weapons. Maybe you press a button to start strafing so that you can avoid fire, and you shoot back in the timing window where you're kind of going to actually hit the enemy. It's a very imprecise thing. But the thing that makes the games, or the thing that makes that kind of combat fun, is the weapons themselves and how they differentiate themselves from not only other games of a similar genre, but also from each other. You'll be getting weapons like a pistol and a shotgun and a grenade launcher and bomb thrower and stuff like that. But even game to game inside the Ratchet and Clank series, their look will be totally different, and the specifics of how they function will be different. And it just makes it really enjoyable to not just use them, but upgrade them and see what you're going to get out of it next.
Yeah, and to your point, not only is it kind of this freeform, but you're really not, you're encouraged to go out into the fray. You're not really encouraged to stay behind cover. There are very specific points in some of the games where that is the best strategy, but in general, there's a lot of health around, and enemies drop a lot of ammo, so you're not really punished for going out and going guns blazing into situations, because frankly, the majority of the time, that's what the game is made for, and it's really fun.
Almost every enemy you fight is going to be a robot or some very odd-looking alien, and regardless of what they look like, they explode when they die. So the faster you shoot your guns and the more effective you are, the more explosions you see on screen, and it's a very gratifying feeling. But the combat is not the only thing in the game. There's also a hefty amount of platforming, and the platforming often takes several different approaches. I'm gonna group all of these under the category of platforming because I think that's the best descriptor for it, but some people may disagree, and that's because platforming, if you don't know the specifics of the term, essentially means being able to run and jump on terrain and using that to get to new areas. It's essentially a kind of micro puzzle that involves you figuring out how to take your character and put them in a new position. So Ratchet and Clank, in all of the levels, have very minor platforming challenges where you will just have to jump from one platform to the next to get to the next combat encounter. They switch this up with a number of different things. Most often, the switch up is that there will be enemies where you want to get to, so you need to take them out before you can make your leap. Otherwise, they'll shoot you in the air and you're not going anywhere. Sometimes they add gadgets, which is what they're called in the game. One that is pretty recurring is kind of a grappling hook. It will either grapple onto a point and zip you to it, or it will grapple onto a point and allow you to kind of Indiana Jones swing across a much larger gap. Sometimes they'll have multiples of these in a row, so you have to get your timing down right for your jumping and grappling. And then there's some more specialized kinds of platforming. One is the rail sections, where Ratchet will he gets these shoes that allow him to grind on rails, and he'll just self-propel himself along, and you have to take down enemies either with his melee attack, which is this massive wrench as big as he is, or with weapons. And you also have to jump to either avoid gaps or bombs or enemy attacks. Depending on the game, you may also have little jetboard sections where you have to kind of do this race, but there's quite a bit of maneuvering and jumping in them, which is why I would still kind of categorize them as platforming. There's some ship sections where the gameplay is essentially the same, but it's got a different skin on it. You're in a little ship rather than being on a jetboard, and just they really diversify the situations you're in so that the gameplay never feels stale. Even though it's always more or less the same thing, you are running and jumping and sometimes shooting. But it's very enjoyable because it's always clear where it is you need to go. Sometimes the environment will change around you because, let's say you're trying to get away from some giant robot, he'll start destroying the things behind you. Or perhaps you're on a train and you have to jump from one train to the next because the train you're on is going to explode. So on top of it just being very exciting, the platforming is solid. You always feel like if you fell, it was your fault, not the game was poorly designed.
Yeah, I think on top of the platforming, because the platforming is there's a lot of variety, and even just not even across the whole series there are a lot of variety, but within every individual entry there's a lot of variety, like you were saying. But one thing that I really like about it is that not only is the platforming and the gadgets fun in the moment, it also makes Ratchet and Clank kind of like, well, I won't say that. There's a lot of secrets throughout the game that most of the time you cannot access until later after you've received a new gadget, like the grind boots because you cross a rail and you can't jump onto it, or the magnet boots because you see a magnetized wall but you can't walk up it because you're not going to get the magnet boots for another 3 planets. And most of the time, hidden behind these secrets are either rhino blueprints so that you can collect to make the strongest gun in the game, or giant golden bolts, which do various things. Most of the time, they'll give you a lot of bolts, which is money in the game, to buy new weapons or new skins or new armor. And I believe most of the games, collecting these gold bolts also unlocks secret cheats in the game that can range from really silly things like giving all the characters really big or really tiny heads, to giving you infinite ammo or making you invincible, or even unlocking, for people who are completionists, would really appreciate these kinds of rewards, you can unlock like a secret level where you can see how the game was developed, or you can unlock secret art books by collecting these secrets. And so I think that's one thing that, especially growing up, it was always super satisfying when I would go back to an earlier planet and be able to find the secret that I wasn't able to access early in the game because of these new gadgets that I've acquired.
Yeah, and I think talking about some of those things, that's part of the reason why the series was so successful, is because they were great value. Not only could you play through them once, but every single game in the series has a new game plus mode. And what this mode does is essentially you start back at the beginning, but you have all the items and gadgets and weapons that you had in the first game. They're all the same level. But for weapons that you had at max level in the first time through, now there's some additional levels that you can bring them through. So everything is significantly harder, but you can upgrade your weapons past what the maximum was supposed to be. In addition to that, you often get a bolt multiplier, which just means that the longer you go without getting hit, the more enemies you defeat without taking damage, the more money you'll be making, because this multiplier will go up, which allows you to not have to, have a really boring time of going to a place, killing a bunch of enemies, leaving, and then going back to farm for this resource. Instead, if you play at a high level, you can just earn it naturally, which is really great because a lot of games don't have that kind of option. So if you want something very specific, you oftentimes have to do grinding or farming, which is very tedious, very boring, and Ratchet and Clank kind of fixes that issue. So not only is the game solid, but you can play it multiple times, even on the same difficulty, and get additional content out of it. So, when you're a young kid and you get, one new game every couple of months, Ratchet and Clank is a real good series to invest in, because you know that it's going to last you for that long.
Yeah, I think that's something, looking beyond Ratchet and Clank for a second, that's something that makes all games fun, in my opinion, assuming it's a good game, is post-game content, good post-game content, and replayability. And Ratchet and Clank has both of those in abundance. You can easily double your playtime in those games after you've beaten the game as it was meant. After you've beaten the game the first time and done a fairly thorough exploration, you can double your time in those games because of how much there is to do after the fact.
And it's funny that you say that you really like post-game content, because for me, generally, I couldn't care less. Mostly because I feel like I want all of my content in the main game. I don't want to have to wait until the game is done to get at everything. But I feel like this is a perfect time where we can kind of talk about the series' highs and lows and our personal opinions on those said highs and lows. The series has currently kind of 4 different types of games. There's the original series, 4 games that came out on PlayStation 2. There's the Future series, which all the game came out on the PlayStation 3. There's the spin-off games. Most of them were either download only or were on a different system. So the original series was on PlayStation 2. The Future series is on PlayStation 3. These spin-offs tended to be on the PlayStation Portable, and I think one of them was even on the PlayStation Vita. You can also get all of them on the PlayStation 3 as well, but they weren't made for that, so they're a little bit different. And then we don't know where this newest game is going to fall, but there was the reimagining. So those are kind of the core entries. The original series, everyone likes most of those games. They feel that, the first one, solid first outing. Second one really built upon that first game and made everything better. Third one grew even better than everything before. The fourth one, called Ratchet Deadlocked, not as many people are fans of that game. I'm going to come back and talk about that because I disagree. But it changed up the formula, and people weren't necessarily fans of that. Then, a couple of years later, PlayStation 3 came out, and we got the Future Saga, and it was called Ratchet and Clank Future: Tools of Destruction. And this one was the start of, it was still a funny series, but they really wanted to focus on that story and make it something a little bit more engaging and interesting. So they put in a lot of backstory on who Ratchet is, what a lombax is as a creature, why he is the only person who looks like that we've seen. Retconning a little bit the third game.
Yeah.
And the second one. Yeah, there's some weird stuff going on there. But all in all, the story was very engaging, and it really set itself up for some really cool things that they could do in the future, and they capitalized on it. At the end of Tools of Destruction, Ratchet and Clank are actually separated. Clank is stolen by an unknown alien species, and no one knows what's going on, and that's how the game ends. So the next game that came out was called Quest for Booty. Yeah, it's all about pirates and taking them down, and essentially it follows Ratchet and a new friend that he's found searching for a way to find Clank and what's happened to him. Once that game was finished, they came out with a Crack in Time. This one you played as Ratchet and Clank separately until you got pretty far into the game, and then they reunited. It was big, heart-wrenching, tear-jerking moment. If you're into that kind of thing. But Crack in Time, for most everyone, is the highlight of the entire franchise. Most everyone regards that as the best game in the series. And then after that, a number of years passed, didn't get any news, and then finally it was announced a new game was coming out called Into the Nexus. Into the Nexus tried to capitalize on the story and how good the previous game was, but really fell short, and we'll probably talk a little bit more specifics on why that is. And I think a lot due to how poorly Into the Nexus did, the next game, Insomniac decided to do kind of a soft reboot, and that's why they reimagined the first game, recreated it with new weapons, new story events, tried to kind of tie everything together. It's a very good game, but missed the mark in a couple of places. We'll talk more on that as to why that is. But that's kind of the highs and lows. The first of the series, probably one of the low points, but no one thinks of it that way because it's what started everything. And then after that, there's a couple of low points, but there's a couple of points that really stand out and really reinvigorated people's interest in the series.
Yeah. I'll let you talk about Ratchet Deadlocked, because I share your opinion that I think it's very underrated and it is one of my favorites in the series, but I'll let you talk a little bit more about why that is. But for me, the two that stand out, Crack in Time, I agree, it probably is technically the best game, but my favorite game is Up Your Arsenal. And that might just be
game.
Yeah, the third game, which may be nostalgia. I concede there's quite a bit of nostalgia that plays into that, because that was by far the Ratchet and Clank game that I played the most. But I really appreciated all the side content that there was to do. I really loved the stadium. I really loved the armor upgrades that you got in that game. I really loved all the mini games that were available in the ship. And I thought it had one of the better stories out of the original 4 PlayStation 2 titles. And I think it is fairly, like you said, it capitalized on Ratchet and Clank and Ratchet and Clank 2's success, and was not complacent. They continued to look for things to make the game better, more engaging, and cram even more content into it. And it was very successful, and I really love that game.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of people that share your sentiments. Up Your Arsenal is definitely one of the high points in the series for everyone. I can't say that I disagree. Up Your Arsenal, fantastic game. Sorry for anyone that doesn't like us using the titles because of their implications, but I mean, it is what it is. So I want to talk a little bit about how I would kind of rate these games, how most people would kind of rate them, and why some of them stand out while others fell flat. So before we talked about, there's the weapons and the gunplay, the actual shooting and how all that works out. There's the platforming, and there are the puzzles. That's the main criteria that people look at for the actual gameplay criteria. There's also, if you want to add in some side content, like Weston said, in most every game there are some activities you can partake in that stray a little bit from the core gameplay, but generally add to the interest. For example, in Up Your Arsenal, there were these in-game video games that you could pick up, and you played as a different character. It was a 2D side-scroller that had a much larger emphasis on tight platforming rather than gunplay, and that was a fun diversion, and it played into the story. There's the rail grinding and racing that I mentioned before. A lot of the games after the first one also started to incorporate some spaceship combat. Some of them incorporated it better than others. So there's a bunch of things that people will look at the gameplay to decide if the game is good. The other two things that are really big are the story, and the level design. Something that a lot of people don't realize is a massive effort, and something that really determines whether something is good or not is the level design. And when it comes to the games that people dislike, it is mostly the level design that really they don't enjoy. And honestly, the only other thing that is ever really an issue in any of the low points of the series, which are still good games, right? There is not a bad game on this list. There's just better games and worse games. But even the worst games in this series have good gameplay. They falter when it comes to story and level design. So let me talk about Ratchet Deadlocked real quick. Ratchet Deadlocked is different from the first 3 games in the series because of a number of things. First, story-wise, it separates itself from the history by putting Ratchet in a location where no one knows who he is or what he's done. So in the first game, he is this unknown ship mechanic that raises himself to glory by saving the universe from a diabolical alien race that is literally destroying planets so that they can take the best pieces of them and make a new one for themselves. So all throughout the second game, everyone knows who Ratchet is and thinks that he's super cool. In the third game, not only is he a well-known hero, but he's actually drafted to help this new military group defend themselves from this big baddie called Dr. Nefarious. In the fourth game, Ratchet gets stolen into this gladiatorial arena where no one knows who he is, and they try to play him as the villain. They try to say that he's the bad guy. And so, more or less, they kind of ignore the previous games story-wise because no one knows who he is. So that's one thing that some people don't really like, is that it's not really a continuation of the story per se. The second thing, you'll notice that the game's name is no longer Ratchet and Clank, it is just Ratchet Deadlocked. The reason for this isn't because because Clank, his companion, is missing from the game, but he's no longer on Ratchet's back throughout the entire game like he is in the previous entries. So in previous entries, Clank was kind of your backpack, and he had these attachments that allowed you to do high jumps, leap across chasms. He really expanded your capabilities when it came to the platforming segments. And he also allowed for some more cerebral puzzle-solving segments because he would be the only one big enough to go into these areas, and he would have a different moveset. He wouldn't have any guns. He'd have a much reduced health system so that he couldn't really engage in combat, and you had to just figure out how to get to where you needed to go in a much more cerebral way rather than Ratchet, who just kind of goes through and beats people up. So he's no longer there. He's still helping you, but he is kind of your Oracle, if you know who that is from the Batman series. He's the person behind the desk that's, talking to Ratchet in his earpiece to let him know what's happening, and he really doesn't play too much into the gameplay itself. On top of that, in most of the games, there are some special gadgets that you pick up that don't have any ramifications when it comes to combat, are purely for platforming / puzzle solving. None of those are in Ratchet Deadlocked, and Ratchet Deadlocked has a much smaller emphasis on platforming. There's very few segments where you need to worry about platforming, getting from one place to the other. So because of these changes, a lot of people don't like Deadlocked because they feel like, it's just all action all the time and it doesn't add much to the series. Now, I can't dispute that they are right when it comes to those things. These are facts about the game. But what I can say is that the game is not worse for missing out on these things. One reason is that while there was a lot of puzzle solving in previous entries, it wasn't always good puzzle solving, right? It wasn't always puzzle solving that you enjoyed. Sometimes it was very obnoxious.
Yeah, the puzzles in some of the games were not very fun, and a lot of them were more time wasters than true puzzles. One that I can think of that I was never ever really a big fan of. I don't remember what it was called, but essentially you got this contraption that could suck up water from a basin and and put it out somewhere else. But only at very certain junctions. You had to be able to interact with these pipes that were going into these basins or into the water. And there's nothing difficult about figuring out those puzzles. They're quite simple and straightforward, but they're also not really fun. They just kind of waste your time. You don't have to think very hard. It's just every time you do it, you have to wait for a cutscene to see the water go down and watch the water come up. And it's just kind of a waste of your time while playing the game, and there's nothing that engaging about it.
Right, which is not to say that all the puzzles are terrible and don't add to the gameplay, but not all of them were perfect. So for me, I really liked the emphasis on Ratchet because he is the character that I liked from the series the most. He's the person who I think is the most interesting, and he's obviously the one that does the most. So missing out on some of those more technical things, didn't feel like a downgrade to me. It felt like it wasn't. If the series was always like this, I do think it would be a disappointment, but it's not. It was a one-off kind of thing, and every now and again doing that where there's more emphasis on the action, I think is perfectly acceptable.
Yeah, if I could just piggyback a little bit off what you've said so far, there are two things that I really like about Deadlock that you haven't mentioned. One is that, yes, even though you lose Clank, you get two other robot companions who are fighting alongside you, and you can order them to go and do things. They'll defend you. They'll plant explosives. There's a whole bunch of different commands you can give them, which you never get for Clank except for in those specific portions in the other games. So people really love Clank for his personality, and he is really good for the platforming sections. But for actual combat, he doesn't really do anything. So I think having two other robots that actually will fight alongside you is a pretty neat addition. I really enjoyed it. The other thing is that the gunplay and the gun modification system is really, really good, because all the guns can be upgraded to level 99 rather than just level 5 or level 10, which makes them really strong for one, and also makes them shoot rainbow bullets, which I think is pretty cool. But more importantly, in Ratchet Deadlock, they added what are called alpha and omega mods that are essentially mods that give your guns different abilities when the bullets hit enemies. For example, one of the mods is napalm, so every time a bullet hits an enemy, a big stretch of napalm gets put onto the floor wherever they were standing, creating an area of effect, burning effect on all the enemies around them. And you can customize what mods are on which guns. So there's a lot more versatility in deciding what your guns do and changing your arsenal the way that you want to change it.
Right. While they did remove some of the more cerebral aspects in terms of platforming, puzzle solving, they made up for it, in my opinion, in the depth that they added to the combat. Generally, Ratchet and Clank, while the combat isn't dumb, it isn't always that cerebral either. You don't need to think too much about what weapon you're using. And most of the enemies are pretty brain dead. They have 1, maybe 2 attacks, and it's based on their distance from you. And as long as you know what those are, easy enough to deal with. Whereas in Ratchet Deadlocked, there was a lot more going on. There was more diversity in the enemies. So you really had to consider what the right modifications were for your weapons to make sure that you were getting the most effect out of them. But I think I've talked enough about why I think Ratchet Deadlocked is underrated. Let's go and talk about Tools of Destruction and Into the Nexus. And talk about why those 2 games are generally regarded as low points and why I personally would agree with that.
Yeah, I think Into the Nexus, I'll just start there. The biggest disappointment for Into the Nexus for me was the lack of was how short it was. There was I again, I don't remember exactly how many planets there are. Maybe you looked it up. There's not many. There's probably half or maybe even a third compared to some of the other Future Saga games, and they aren't even terribly expansive. Like, it would have almost been forgivable had the planets been significantly longer than they had been in the past, but that wasn't the case. It just felt like a smaller game, like you were paying more than you should have compared to almost all the previous entries. Is that you were not getting nearly the value out of Into the Nexus as you got out of Crack in Time, or even Up Your Arsenal way back on the PS2.
You know, personally, I don't really like to rate games on their price versus length, because if we did that, then games that are incredibly long but not necessarily good would, you know, be really high up there on value. I do agree, and you know, again, this is a fact. Into the Nexus is significantly shorter than almost any game in the franchise, including the short kind of side ones. That is disappointing. But for me, the reason that Into the Nexus was such a failure was twofold. First, the story was not nearly as interesting or engaging as they wanted it to be. And 2, the level design was atrocious and even broken in some cases. Now, before I told you that there's a bunch of different criteria that people use for kind of rating these Ratchet and Clank games. Ratchet and Clank Deadlocked, you know, the main reason people didn't like it was because of the level design, not because it was bad, but because it was different, and the gameplay tweaks. That they wanted more of the puzzle solving and they didn't get it, so they were disappointed. Into the Nexus also does not have a lot of puzzle solving, but the biggest, most egregious sin it has is its terrible level design. First of all, the levels themselves are not particularly difficult to navigate or interesting. They tried to add in a mechanic where you get a jetpack to travel around the world. And really, this just kind of bit them in the butt, because one of the things that makes Ratchet and Clank engaging is the platforming. If you can fly, there is no platforming. Flying is not difficult. You can land and go anywhere. So it really did not work out. And the broken piece is that in all previous Ratchet and Clank series, at least as far as I have been able to see, playing through them all, there are many levels where the level changes as you progress through it. When that happens, the game developers have always provided some way to continue traversing through that level if you go back to it after you've completed it. Sometimes this means that there's a rail section that gets blown up So they put either a teleport pad or a taxi that you'll ride to just skip it. And this is fine because there's nothing that you needed in that area. It was a set piece, just a very interesting engagement to go through that you don't need to do again. Sometimes the terrain gets altered because of some fight you had. Sometimes there's doors that are locked that become unlocked, and there's all these different things that can happen. But the designers always made sure that there was some acceptable way to get through the level after completing it the first time. Into the Nexus does not have this. Into the Nexus has 1 or 2 levels that after you've gone through it once, you cannot complete it a second time unless you go through New Game Plus. This is unacceptable. This is absolutely abysmal game design and level design, and I cannot believe it made it into the end product, because it's just, that is one of the worst things of you're going through a level and then halfway through you find out you can't complete it because it's broken. And you just have to leave that level, and if you missed something, you have to finish the game, go back through, and hope you don't miss it the next time through. And I cannot believe that happened, and that's one of the big reasons why Into the Nexus was such a disappointment.
Yeah, and I see what you mean, kind of overall, and what you said about like value and time and game length. I agree with that. My bigger issue, and the bigger issue overall that links into what you just said, is the precedent. The precedent set by every game before that was suddenly broken into the Nexus with poor level design, really, really short, and not, and I, for me personally, I really didn't like the Clank sections. He had some specific sections within that game that I thought were not nearly as interesting as they had been in past games. And it just seemed like it had been made by a completely different developer, like it had been outsourced or something. That the quality control just wasn't there anymore, which was really disappointing to me when I first played it, and I know is why it was so disappointing to most people who played it.
Well, and remember, to be fair, there aren't any bad games in this series. I'm ripping on Into the Nexus pretty hard, but it's still a enjoyable game, and there are pieces of it that are good. In all likelihood, either Insomniac's core team that was working on this was burnt out because it's the thing that they've been working on over and over and over again for years. Into the Nexus released in 2013. 2013, yeah. So 11 years after the first game. So they have been literally working on this same franchise for over 11 years because they were working on the first one for years before it came out, right? Maybe 2 years, I don't know exactly the development time, but there's a good chance that they have been working on this singular franchise for 13 years. I don't care how much you love a series or how successful it is easy to get burnt out on that. So either they had a different internal group take care of it and they just didn't have the proper oversight or the proper funding for it or the proper time management, or something happened and it did not come out the way they wanted it to. And it's a travesty, and it's especially a travesty because the next game that came out also wasn't super well received. And I think the biggest reason is because the story had some failings. And let's transition to that. The other two games that aren't seen as well as the others, and maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm different from everyone else, but Tools of Destruction didn't hit the same highs of the rest of the series. And I think it's for the same reason that the Ratchet and Clank reimagining game didn't hit it, and it's mostly story reasons. In Tools of Destruction, the story is a lot more expansive and detailed than previous entries. And Weston, if you want to kind of talk a little bit about that story.
Oh man, you're drawing on memory banks that I'm not sure I have. So if you know what it is, you should maybe give a better. You'd probably be better at summarizing it than I would be.
Well, as a brief overview, it goes into the backstory of Ratchet, and they essentially explain Ratchet is the only lombax in the universe. He is the only person of his species that exists, and they decide to go into why that is. So the main villain in this game, I can't remember his name.
Emperor Tachyon. He's a Cragmite. He's a little tiny dude.
There you go. Emperor Tachyon is this Cragmite. The Cragmites were banished to a different dimension by the lombax species years and years and years ago, before Ratchet was born. Everyone except for, what's his name, Dr.
Emperor Tachyon?
Yes, Tachyon. So all the Cragmites got left behind except for Tachyon, because Tachyon is the only kind of sentient Cragmite. He's this tiny guy that's not particularly strong himself, whereas the rest of the Cragmites are incredibly powerful. And because of that, he didn't get banished. So he starts working with the Lombaxes and convinces them to create a device that he has devised. Most everyone is against it except for one guy, and he's like, I'll give him a chance. Well, that was a bad idea, because what this device did was send every single Lombax into a different universe. Everyone except for two. I know before I said there was only one, but this is how the story frames it. They say that he's the last one left, and then he finds out, there's actually one other person. So throughout the story of this game, you learn these things, and you try to prevent Tachyon from bringing the Cragmites back. You fail, so you have to fight Cragmites for a good portion of the game, and then you finally get rid of Tachyon, banish him to an alternate dimension along with the rest of the Cragmites, and you're like, oh good, everything's good. And then back to what I said before, Clank is stolen by a different species. They're called the Zoni, and they're generally regarded as good, helpful aliens, but for some reason they decide to steal Clank. Now, my big issue with Tools of Destruction story-wise, while it had a great foundation, Tachyon just wasn't a very interesting enemy, and he was such a whiner, and his voice was so annoying that I didn't want to take him down like, oh, this is such a great villain. I wanted to take him down and be like, please shut up and stop talking.
Yeah, I think definitely none of the antagonists throughout the game have reached the levels of one who was reintroduced in Kraken Time. His name is Dr. Nefarious, and he was the main antagonist in Up Your Arsenal, which was also something that set that game apart, was that he was by far the best antagonist out of any of the main 4 games, and probably any of the games in general. And it's been hinted in the trailer for the new one that he's coming back, which definitely is one reason I'm excited for it beyond some of the newer games that have come out. But I think you're definitely right. The story in Tools of Destruction and Emperor Tachyon himself were just not up to snuff compared to Dr. Nefarious and even the villain from Deadlocked.
Yeah, the series generally has pretty solid enemies that you want to take out. The very first one, the guy who's destroying planets, he is a corporate CEO. So obviously, ahead of its time, wanted to take on the man because they're super against the environment and whatnot. But Tools of Destruction, that villain, while he set up a great storyline that really enhanced the lore of the series, it was very disappointing in him himself. And that's kind of the biggest issue with the Ratchet and Clank reimagining. First of all, anytime you remake a game, there's going to be a good number of people that dislike it unless it is exactly the same as what came before. And yet there's going to be an equal amount of people that hate it if it's exactly the same, because they're like, you could have improved it. Well, Ratchet and Clank, the reimagined one that came out in, what was it, 2016?
Yeah.
2017?
2016, yeah.
Yeah, 2016 kind of had the worst of both worlds, according to many people. I don't necessarily agree with this, but a lot of people didn't like the changes to the story, and they felt like they didn't change enough of the gameplay to really warrant this new entry. I disagree. I think that the story was pretty solid, and I loved how they took a lot of what the lore became in future games and brought it back into the original and tried to make a more homogenous kind of storyline, something that brought in villains much earlier and kind of made it make more sense why there would be such an antagonistic standoff between Ratchet and Clank and this villain. However, the story still falls short in a couple of places, and that's because it was developed in tandem with a CGI movie that covered the same events. But the movie and this game don't follow the exact same storyline, and there are pieces of the story that are missing from the game that are only filled in the movie. So I watched the movie and then I played the game, and I noticed pieces that were just missing. And I'm like, why did they take that out? That was, something that would have enhanced the story. And it's because they wanted to incorporate more gameplay into it. So they had to cut pieces out that wouldn't allow the player to interact. And while I understand that you buy a game because you want to play it, if you're going to make the story less coherent and less engaging to make the gameplay more engaging, in all likelihood, you're just kind of shooting yourself in the foot. And I think the issue really lies with they shouldn't have developed a game and a movie about the exact same events at the exact same time.
Yeah, that's kind of ridiculous to think that, you don't have a time cap on a game. You got a time cap on a movie. You should probably, if anything, you should be cutting things out of the movie that were in the game. Story-wise, not the other way around.
Yeah, I'm sure that there's other issues that people had with it, but rather than dwelling on the negative, let's dwell on the positive and talk about what we're hoping from this newest game that has been announced. For me, a big thing is that, like you said, they said a name of the most popular, most well-respected antagonist of the series, Dr. Nefarious. So, in all likelihood, he is going to be the main threat of the game, which is good news because he is such a fun antagonist. He's not necessarily menacing, per se.
Yeah, no.
But he is hilarious, and he is the perfect kind of antagonist for Ratchet and Clank because it is such a comedic series. So really hoping that he's in there and, it's not just a tease, but that he is used to full effect and that he's a real fun enemy to take on this time.
Yeah, I'm hoping for that as well. They have undercut their villains in the very end before, and I hope they don't do that because I'm not a fan of that pretty much ever. But I hope that there's more. I hope they return to form with side content and secrets, which I felt were a little bit definitely lacking from Into the Nexus, a little bit lacking from Tools of Destruction, and a little bit lacking from the newest entry.
Yeah, and hopefully, and what's really exciting is it seems like they're continuing the storyline from at least A Crack in Time, if not Into the Nexus. And the story of Into the Nexus, while it wasn't quite long enough to be as interesting as it could have been, was not bad. So continuing from that point would be perfectly acceptable. But at the very least, it looks like they're playing into the idea that Ratchet is currently the last lombax in existence. The other lombax dies in A Crack in Time, so it's back to just being Ratchet. And at the end of the gameplay trailer for this newest release, they show a female lombax. So obviously people are like, oh, it's probably going to be a love interest, and where did she come from, and what's going to happen when she and Ratchet meet, and like, is that going to be a big part of it? Perhaps she could be a secondary character that you play as, because near the end of the game, of the gameplay trailer, Ratchet and Clank are separated. A big piece of the gameplay seems to be that there are these rifts kind of in space-time that Ratchet is able to manipulate. So he goes from at least world to world, if not universe to universe, through these cracks. And when he gets separated from Clank, perhaps I'm reaching here, but it seems to me very plausible that this new female lombax could be a separate character that you play as, at least for a short amount of time until Clank meets back up with Ratchet. If they do that, it could be really interesting. It could also fall flat, because if you're fighting with one enemy, you're leveling up their weapons and not the other person's weapons. But don't want to nail anything down too soon.
Yeah, I think one thing that I'm hoping for is a little bit more is weapon customization, which they've done a good job of in the past. And I'm hoping that they use the rift mechanic well. I'm hoping that they maybe do something kind of like BioShock Infinite, where it's more than just traveling location to location, but you can use it within battles not only to travel, but also to, get other helps and manipulate the environment to your advantage and to...
Did you not see the second gameplay example?
No, I did not.
Yeah, because that's exactly what they do. Not necessarily pulling things in, but you'll see these kind of yellow rifts all over the place, and Ratchet can pull on them, and he will essentially teleport to that location in a really interesting way. I would suggest check that out.
No, I saw that. I'm hoping that there's more than just that, which, like, the teleportation thing is cool, but I hope there's other ways that you can use the rifts to manipulate stuff, to bring in, like, ammo or health or a rock slide from somewhere else on the map, that you can see that then slams like a whole line of enemies, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think the only big trepidation I have about the game currently is Sony is using it to show off the capabilities of their system, specifically with just the power of it. The game looks like it was developed by Pixar. It's beautiful. But also the very rapid loading with transporting from area to area so quickly, almost instantaneously. I hope that that's not all it is, and that they didn't shoehorn these mechanics in because Sony told them to, but they wanted to utilize them in an interesting way, just because a number of studios have done that in the past. Specifically, Nintendo has a history of creating games specifically to show off what their system can do, and the game sucks because that's all that went into it. Anyone who's played Star Fox Zero knows what I'm talking about. It's very disappointing, because a game that could have been fantastic was severely distracting and held back because some big brain at Nintendo, I think it was Shigeru Miyamoto, decided that he wanted to use a specific type of game mechanic that you could only do on that system, and that specific game mechanic was confusing and sucked, and did not make the game better. So hoping that is not the case. I kind of lean towards it not, just because Sony has been pretty stellar with their first-party titles this entire generation. Doesn't make a lot of sense for that to change now, but there's always the possibility. So hopefully that doesn't happen, and the story of this continues where it got left off, and is really engaging, really fun. Hopefully the level design is really interesting and engaging and isn't just an excuse to show off the loading times, and of course hopefully the weapon usages and the weapon customization is very intriguing and something that's solid that we can really sink our teeth into.
So overall, Ratchet and Clank is a great series. If you're listening to this and you have the means to play and you haven't, I think we definitely both recommend picking it up. There's a number of collections that they have online, and you can always find them on Amazon and eBay and stuff like that. It's just, they're great. They're a great time, and right now is a great time to get into them because there's a new one on the way.
That's right. And I think to wrap up, going back to talking about what makes games fun, what makes these games fun is that they're approachable by anyone from any skill level. They've got action, they've got tactical, more cerebral things to think about. They've got platforming, they've got racing, they've got something for just about everyone. And they do it in a way that's very engaging, even during parts that you might not enjoy as much as others. And that's why they are such a solid franchise, whereas some other people who have tried the same thing have not been quite as successful.
And we want to hear what you think about what makes games fun and what you like about Ratchet and Clank, or any thoughts that you have about the podcast at all. You can send us an email and help others reflect with us too by rating and reviewing the podcast. It will really help us out and help us reach a wider audience. But we really appreciate you being around for this.
That's right. Send an email. Tell me that I'm completely wrong about Deadlocked or Into the Nexus or Tools of Destruction. Tell me that I'm a complete idiot because I like games that are bad or I dislike games that are good. Fight me. Let's do this. It is all about discussion.
We really appreciate you tuning in, and we hope that we'll catch you next time.
And until then, hope you guys have a good week.
Bye.